The courtroom buzzed like a hive, voices murmuring just loud enough to reach me as I adjusted the strap of my bag. My heart always beat a little faster before a case started, but this time something felt different. It wasn't nerves. I'd been a defense attorney for over 30 years. Nerves stopped being a problem after the first decade. No, this was something else, something more primal. And I didn't know it yet, but this day was about to change everything. I stepped through the heavy oak doors and scanned the room out of habit. The same dull beige walls, the same polished benches, the same vaguely stressed court clerk flipping through a stack of papers. But then I saw him. He was standing by the plaintiff's table, leaning casually with one arm resting on the edge, his posture effortlessly confident. It wasn't just his youth or the way his suit fit him perfectly, though both were hard to miss. It was the energy he radiated, sharp, assured, commanding. He turned as if sensing my gaze and met my eyes. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. It wasn't attraction, at least not in the way I'd known it before. It was deeper, a pull from somewhere I couldn't name. Something in the tilt of his head, the way his lips curved into a subtle, knowing smile, triggered a whisper of recognition I didn't understand. I blinked, breaking the connection, and told myself to focus. I had a job to do, and no amount of courtroom charisma was going to distract me. "Morning, Cassie," my client murmured as I sat down at the defense table. He was a wiry man in his early 20s, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Accused of petty theft, he had more bad luck than bad intentions. "Do you think we've got a shot?" I gave him my standard reassuring smile. "We have more than a shot. We've got facts on our side." It was true. The case was flimsy at best. Blurry security footage, circumstantial evidence, and an alibi that placed my client at home during the supposed crime. If everything went as it should, this would be over in an hour, 2 tops. Easy work. But as the young prosecutor strode to his seat, I felt that strange pull again, as if the universe was leaning in to whisper, "Pay attention." The judge entered, and the room quieted. Introductions were made, arguments began, and I fell into my rhythm. I loved this part. The way words could be wielded like tools, reshaping the narrative, revealing the cracks in the opposition's story. It was a game of logic, precision, and strategy, and I had decades of practice. But even as I dismantled the prosecutor's arguments piece by piece, I couldn't help but notice him. Matthew Genrick. That's what the judge called him during introductions. The name suited him, sharp and modern. He argued well for someone his age, his tone measured and persuasive, though it was clear he didn't have much to work with. I watched as he flipped through his notes, a furrow forming between his brows when he couldn't find a foothold in my client's testimony. It was almost endearing, the way he masked his frustration with a quick sip of water or a slight adjustment of his tie. And then, just as I thought I had him cornered, he did something unexpected. He smiled, not the strained, performative kind I'd seen countless times in courtrooms, but a genuine, almost amused smile. It was brief, just a flicker, but it threw me off balance. What was he playing at? I narrowed my eyes and refocused, but that smile lingered in my mind like the echo of a bell. By the time the judge ruled in my client's favor, I was back on solid ground. Relief washed over me, familiar and satisfying. My client shook my hand, grinning ear to ear, and I felt the usual swell of pride in a job well done. But as I gathered my papers and prepared to leave, I made the mistake of glancing toward the prosecutor's table. Matthew was watching me. His expression was unreadable, but there was no trace of bitterness, no sign of defeat. Instead, he gave me a slight nod, as if acknowledging the fight I'd put up. And then he smiled again, just a hint of it this time, warm and genuine. I hesitated, tempted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say to someone like him? Instead, I nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of his efforts, and walked out of the courtroom. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, finalizing paperwork, congratulating my client, driving home through the thick Philadelphia traffic. But the moment I stepped into my apartment, that empty, echoing space I'd called home for the past 3 years, I felt the weight of the day settle over me. I tried distracting myself, flipping through TV channels, reading briefs for my next case, but nothing worked. My mind kept circling back to him, to the way he carried himself, to the subtle intensity in his eyes, to that smile. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, wondering why a simple courtroom encounter had left such a mark. "It's nothing," I told myself aloud, the words hollow in the empty room. Just a good-looking kid doing his job. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something about him had stirred something in me. Something I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. A week passed, though it felt longer. Work had its usual demands, but my mind kept wandering back to that courtroom. To him. I hated it, the way my thoughts betrayed me. I had never let anyone, especially a stranger, distract me from my work. Yet there I was, revisiting every moment I had spent locked in that unspoken connection with Matthew Genrick. It was maddening. That Friday night, my friends dragged me out for drinks. I was reluctant at first. Bars weren't my scene anymore. I hadn't gone out like this in years, not since my divorce. But they were persistent, and I didn't have the energy to argue. So I put on a red dress that had been gathering dust in my closet, threw on some heels, and met them at a cozy little spot in Center City. The bar was crowded and alive, buzzing with the energy of a weekend in full swing. My friends and I found a corner booth, ordered drinks, and fell into easy conversation. For the first time in days, I felt myself relaxing. The martinis helped, of course, their sharp edge dulling the tension in my chest. I laughed more than I had in weeks, letting their stories and jokes carry me away from my thoughts. Until I saw him. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't in a suit this time. Just a dark shirt and jeans that fit him in a way that felt almost unfair. His hair was slightly tousled, and his expression was softer, more casual, but there was no mistaking it. It was Matthew. He was standing at the bar, chatting with a group of people I didn't recognize. A drink rested in his hand, and he smiled at something someone said, his laugh quiet but genuine. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart raced, and I cursed the reaction. This was ridiculous. He was just a man, a younger man, a colleague technically. There was no reason for me to feel this way. But then he turned, and his eyes met mine. For a moment, he looked as surprised as I felt. Then his lips curved into that same warm smile I'd seen in the courtroom. My stomach flipped, and before I could stop myself, I smiled back. My friends noticed immediately. "Who's that?" one of them asked, her voice teasing. "Just someone I know from work," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. But the blush creeping up my neck betrayed me. "Go talk to him," another friend urged, nudging me with her elbow. "No, absolutely not," I protested, shaking my head. "That would be inappropriate. Since when are you afraid to talk to someone? You're Cassie. You argue in front of judges for a living." I sighed, taking a long sip of my martini for courage. They weren't going to let this go, and truthfully, a part of me didn't want them to. The wine-fueled bravery of the courtroom was nothing compared to the liquid courage coursing through me now. I stood, smoothing my dress, and made my way to the bar. He didn't notice me until I was almost beside him, and when he turned, his eyes widened in surprise. "Cassie," he said, his voice warm and familiar, like we were old friends. "Fancy seeing you here." "Matthew," I replied, summoning a smile. "You're a long way from the courtroom." He chuckled, setting his drink down. "And you're a long way from intimidating defense speeches." I laughed, letting the tension melt away. "Touché." We fell into easy conversation, the noise of the bar fading into the background. He told me about his first few years as a prosecutor, the struggles of finding his footing in such a competitive field. I shared a few war stories from my early days as a defense attorney, the kind of anecdotes that felt distant yet vivid at the same time. There was something disarming about the way he listened, his focus entirely on me, as if nothing else in the room mattered. Somewhere in the middle of our conversation, I realized how much I was enjoying myself. It was rare to find someone who could keep up with me in a discussion, who didn't flinch at my sharp wit or retreat behind politeness. But Matthew seemed to relish it, meeting my jabs with his own clever retorts, his smile never fading. "Do you always win your cases?" he asked at one point, his tone light but curious. "Not always," I admitted, "but often enough." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're good. I saw that in court." "Thank you," I said, feeling an unexpected warmth at his compliment. "You're not bad yourself, you know." He grinned, leaning slightly closer. "Coming from you, that's high praise." I felt my cheeks heat, and for once I didn't mind. The moment stretched, the air between us charged with something unspoken. I thought about stepping back, about retreating to the safety of my friends and pretending this night had never happened. But instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. Would you like to join me for another drink? I asked, my voice soft. His smile widened and he nodded. I'd love to. We spent the rest of the night talking, the hours slipping away unnoticed. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. He offered to walk me to my car, and I accepted, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the heat of the bar. As we stood by my car, I hesitated, unsure of how to end the night. But before I could overthink it, he leaned in and kissed me on the cheek, his touch brief but lingering. Good night, Cassie, he said, his voice low. Good night, Matthew, I replied, my heart pounding. As I drove home, I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. But beneath the thrill of the evening, a quiet voice whispered a warning. This wasn't a simple connection. It was something much more complicated. And it was only just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating my apartment in a golden glow. I blinked against the light, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of another person in my bed. Then it all came rushing back. The bar, the laughter, the hesitant kiss on my cheek that had melted into something deeper the moment we stepped inside my apartment. Matthew lay beside me, his dark lashes casting soft shadows against his cheek. He looked so different like this, peaceful and unguarded, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply enjoy his presence. It had been so long since I'd let anyone this close, physically or emotionally. But as the quiet stretched, a nagging thought clawed at the edges of my mind. What now? The answer came faster than I expected, in the form of a shrill ringtone cutting through the morning calm. Matthew stirred, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. I sat up, instinctively pulling the blanket around me, watching as he answered with a groggy, "Hello?" He frowned slightly, his voice clearing. "Hey, Dad. Dad." My stomach twisted at the word, though I couldn't explain why. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with tidying up, but I couldn't block out his half of the conversation. "Yeah, I stayed out late," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "No, nothing serious. Just catching up with someone." There was a pause, then he laughed softly. I know. Tell Linda I'll call her later." Linda. My hands froze. The name ricocheted in my mind, sharp and insistent. It couldn't be. Could it? Matthew hung up and turned to me, his expression warm but curious. "Everything okay?" "Who's Linda?" I asked, my voice too casual, betraying none of the storm brewing inside me. He smiled, oblivious. "My stepmom. My dad married her a few years ago." My chest tightened. "And your dad's name?" "Robert," he said, frowning slightly. "Why?" "Robert." "Linda." The names crashed over me like a tidal wave. I struggled to breathe, my thoughts spinning out of control. It's a coincidence, I told myself, but the truth was already crystallizing in my mind. "What does your dad do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "He's an air traffic controller," Matthew replied, his confusion deepening. "Cassie, what's going on?" I couldn't answer. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as my worst fears confirmed themselves. Robert Thompson, my ex-husband. Linda, the woman he'd left me for. And Matthew, this brilliant, kind, magnetic man, was his son. Or rather, his stepson. "I need a minute," I managed to say, my voice strangled. I stood and walked to the kitchen, gripping the counter for support. My mind raced, replaying every interaction with Matthew, every moment that had felt so electric, so right. And now this, a cruel twist of fate that turned something beautiful into something impossible. Matthew followed me, his concern etched deeply on his face. "Cassie, talk to me. Please." I turned to him, my emotions a whirlwind. "Matthew, your dad, Robert Thompson. He's my ex-husband." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as realization dawned on his face, his eyes widening, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but finding no words. "I didn't know," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I swear I didn't know." "Neither did I replied, my voice trembling. "Until now." We stood there, the weight of the revelation pressing down on us. There was no handbook for a moment like this, no guide for how to navigate a situation so absurd, so tangled. My mind screamed for me to end it, to walk away and never look back. But my heart didn't want to let go. "Cassie," Matthew began, stepping closer. "I don't know what this means, but I know how I feel about you. That hasn't changed." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let myself sink back into the warmth and comfort I'd found with him, to ignore the complications and pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. I don't know if I can do this, I said, tears brimming in my eyes. It's too much. Matthew hesitated, his hands curling into fists at his sides, as if trying to hold himself together. I don't have all the answers, he said quietly. But I know one thing. You've made me feel something I haven't felt in years. And I think you feel it too. I closed my eyes, his words cutting through the chaos in my mind. He was right. I did feel it. But the weight of everything else, the history, the connections, the impossible circumstances, felt insurmountable. I need time, I said finally, my voice steady but fragile. I need to figure this out. Matthew nodded, his expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. And with that, he left, the door clicking softly behind him. I stood there, staring at the empty space he'd just occupied, my heart aching with a confusing mix of longing and loss. As the city buzzed on outside, I realized that life had handed me a puzzle with no clear solution. But in the midst of the uncertainty, one thing was clear. I wasn't the same woman I'd been a week ago. And for better or worse, I never would be again.